Welcome to the February 2019 Mississippi PowerShell User Group meeting. My name is Mike Robbins. I go by Mike F. Robbins online, and tonight I'll be presenting a session on PowerShell and SQL Server is better together. So a little bit about me. You're not here to learn about me, but as I said, I'm Mike F. Robbins. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I was a PowerShell MVP for a couple of years. They rolled everybody up in the cloud and data center. So that's what I've been for the last 3 years. Of course, I run the Mississippi PowerShell User Group, and that's where the meeting is tonight. You're not here to learn about me, but if you're interested, I try to blog on a regular basis, mikefrobbins.com. And hey, this is all going to be demo, so it's demo time. The content, the slide deck, which is not much of a slide deck, and also the script, the demo script, has been uploaded to GitHub already. And just to give you an idea what we've got here. So I've got a domain controller, I've got a SQL 2005, 2008, 2012, 2014, 2016, 2017, and then a Windows 10 box. The operating systems are various operating systems. The newer ones are running 2019. All the servers are server core except for the older ones, of course. The SQL 2005, that's a 64-bit OS, no PowerShell. Because it's running Windows 2008, but it's 32-bit SQL. I tried to throw some things into the mix to try to cause problems, because you'll find those sort of things in your environment. I think the SQL 2008 is Windows 2008. The SQL 2012 is Windows 2012. I think a couple of them are running Windows 2016, and then Windows 2019 on the domain controller and the SQL 2017 box. Okay, you know, one thing I said in the synopsis for this session is I would talk a little bit about the ISC and Visual Studio Code. Now, of course, the ISC is more of a mature product. I was just making sure I had internet connectivity. I've got my script in the ISC. So the ISC is the stable product. There's no new development unless there's security problems with the ISC. One of the things I like about the ISC, or integrated scripting environment, is that it's on every box I touch. So like I have a VM here, it's on there by default. And if you're doing development, yes, there are some advantages to using Visual Studio Code or VS Code, and I think everybody here probably knows that VS Code is an open source product. It's built on top of Electron. It's a free product. Even though it's called Visual Studio Code, it's not Visual Studio. But not in the sense of the older Visual Studio that installs everything but the kitchen sink if you take the defaults and bloats your machine, and for a non-developer you just don't need that. But I do like Visual Studio Code. I have it on this machine. There's a few extensions that I do like. So the PowerShell one, of course, I like the settings sync, which I was talking about earlier, and the VS Code icons. And I like to use the theme that makes Visual Studio Code look like the ISC, because it doesn't seem so foreign. For the most part in this session, I'm just going to go ahead and use the ISC because presenting I feel more comfortable using it. But for the most part, I can run any of the same code in either one of the platforms and it would work fine. Now, so this just a little bit about the presentation. This is one thing I like to put at the top of my scripts. I like to put throw. I used to put break, but break doesn't always break because break is designed to break out of a loop, and I've had some scenarios where it didn't break, but throw will always throw. So if I have it F5 instead of F8, the script's gonna stop, and instead of running the whole demo, and the demo would be over with. One of the other things is, so I've increased the font to 150%. If that's not large enough for anybody, just let me know. But I like changing the errors to yellow when I'm presenting, because if anybody's colorblind, the red on the blue or on the black is, especially on if you were using a projector, it's not very good. So what I've done on this machine, I've actually, to extend PowerShell, you extend it with modules, and the older type with snap-ins. But for the most part nowadays, you will find modules. You'll still find some snap-ins floating around. And a couple of the machines I'm going to show you tonight is going to have snap-ins. But I've run this command. I've installed the SQL Server module from the PowerShell gallery. And of course, install module is a part of PowerShell Get, part of the PowerShell Get PowerShell module that ships with PowerShell 5, and of course PowerShell 5 ships with Windows 10 by default. Now you can download an MSI installer and install PowerShell Get on PowerShell 3 and 4, but the problem is the SQL Server module, they're actually requiring PowerShell 5. So even if you install PowerShell Get on PowerShell 3 or 4, you would not be able to take advantage of the SQL Server module, and more than likely they're not using any functionality that actually requires 5, because 90% of the code that runs in 5 is going to run in 3 and 4. It's probably just some arbitrary setting that they have set, and that's one of the reasons there's the Dba Tools module, which is an open source module that numerous SQL Server professionals and PowerShell professionals have created, but it does not require PowerShell 5, so that might be one of the reasons you want to use it instead of the SQL Server module. I've also installed the RSAT tools. And with Windows version 10, 1809 and higher, you can install those with the Add Windows capability. It's called Features on Demand is what it's really called. You can do it with the GUI, but it's easier in PowerShell. And I've got a blog article about how to do that and a video out on TechSnips. So there's a couple of modules that I've created. So I've got my Mr. Toolkit module installed. I've got my Mr. SQL one installed. And I'm going to go ahead and import all these modules. And that'll be fine. My Mr. Toolkit, I'm actually in the process of kind of breaking it up because I've got like some Hyper-V commandlets and stuff like that in it. So we've got a few errors here, but the majority of these are going to be from my Mr. Toolkit module, because there's some modules that I'm requiring, and all those particular commands won't work. The other ones will still work, but I need to clean that up. I'm going to break it up so that I have like a Mr. Hyper-V module, and of course I've already got Mr. SQL and so on. The other thing is the default execution policy of restricted. You can't use the majority of the commands I'm going to be running. The underlying modules won't allow you to use them with restricted, so you need to be remote signed or less. And when you set that, even though I've set it, I'm going to just hit this. I recommend going out to this website and reading what it says, because there's some security risk associated with that. however very small. Really, execution policy is not designed to be a security boundary. It's designed to prevent a user from unknowingly running a script. I want to show you the few modules I've got. So I've got a few modules on this machine. Now these are the ones that are loaded and ready to be used, but if I ran list available, you'd see a lot more modules. Like I said, this was designed to present for a SQL Server user group who not everybody there uses PowerShell all the time. But you can see that I think there's over 100 modules. I've installed a few, but I think there's even 100 by default. And of course, with PowerShell 3, you've got module auto loading. If you have your modules in the PS module path, and by default there's 3 different areas you could put those in. And your user path is actually under your documents Windows PowerShell. Me personally, I never use that path because I log into Windows as one user and I run PowerShell as a different one. So if I drill down to documents in the GUI, it's not the same documents that it's a different user in PowerShell. So the program files folder path, which is the all users folder for modules, is where I put mine, and that module was created with PowerShell, or that path was created with PowerShell 4. And the Windows, you'll read some documentation and it'll say that this path under Windows System 32 is where the all users module folder is, and that's incorrect nowadays. They want you to put them in program files, because I've specifically been told by members of the PowerShell team that only Microsoft should be putting things in the System 32 folder. So I'll just look at what PowerShell version I've got on all these machines. At least the SQL 05 is going to time out because there's no PowerShell at all on it. So I've got various versions. I've got version 3, I've got version 4, I've got version 5. And I think at work I even have one box that's got version 2. It's a Exchange 2010 server that we're in the process of migrating to Office 365. But it's been my experience Exchange is one of those things that don't update the PowerShell version on it, not unless you like problems. Now when you install SQL Server, and they've changed this a few times, it installs, at least with newer versions of SQL Server, it installs a SQL PS PowerShell module. And at one time they had changed it where it was installing the SQL Server PowerShell module, and then they changed it back. So you may go check and they may change it again. But you can see at least the SQL 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2017 all have a SQL PS module. And the reason the SQL 2008 doesn't is because with 2008 it was still a snap-in. So I'll do a one-to, and the command I just ran, of course, was a one-to-many remoting session. I'm sure everybody here probably knows that, but so I ran a command and it just returned the results. But I'm going to do a one-to-one remoting session now. Let's see. So I'm on the SQL 08 box, and I'll just show you the name of it is SQL 08. So I'm going to import try to import the SQL PS module, and you'll see, hey, it can't find it. And even if we run get module SQL PS list available, yeah, no module by that name. But if I run get snap-in, and if you run get snap-in, this works kind of the same way as get module with and without list available. It's a little bit different, but you have to use dash registered. So you can see these are the SQL ones. And I'm going to add the SQL Server, those two SQL Server snap-ins. And if I run get command, and the funny thing is, get command with the module parameter, it actually works on snap-ins and modules. And there's an alias for that parameter that's, I think it's called snap-in or PS snap-in, one of the two. But anyway, you can see with SQL 2008, you only had like 5 commands. And this is where they got into the unapproved verbs, because encode and decode, of course, there's not approved verbs. But with snap-ins, you didn't get an error when you imported them. So everything was kind of fat and happy. So I'm going to get out of the SQL 08 box. Let's jump into the 2012 box. We'll import the module. And I won't do this on every single one of these, because when you get to SQL 2016, I want to show you how many commands. Now when you import the module, of course, they're still using encode and decode, and those are not approved verbs, so you get the nasty error message when you import it. So you can see there are a number of commands now. There's a lot more than 5 or however many were in SQL 2008. There's 34 commands. And I think with SQL 2014, maybe they had all of them. And starting, I believe, with 2016, they fixed the slowness of the import. Where I know some of the people that kind of worked on this problem. Oh, and you can also see that they changed to the SQL Server PS drive. So there's 46 commands, so there's a little more. And so I'm not going to run this on the SQL 2016 and 2017, but I can tell you on those two, there's 49 commands. So like I said, I have the SQL Server PowerShell module installed. When you install SQL Server Management Studio nowadays, it's a separate download from the SQL ISO. And you don't, at one time, you got the SQL Server PowerShell module with the SQL Server Management Studio before they put the SQL Server PowerShell module in the PowerShell gallery. And then they kind of decoupled that. So when you install SQL Server Management Studio today, the latest version, you don't get the PowerShell module. You have to go install that separately from the PowerShell gallery, and that has changed a number of times also. So you can see there's 105 commands as of now. Now the Dba Tools module that I was talking about earlier, and a lot of people, maybe you can or cannot bring third-party open source modules into your company. Some companies will allow you to put them on your workstation, but not on the server themselves. And if that's the case, then there's no problem, because you can put this on your workstation and run the commands remotely against SQL Server. You don't have to put it on the server. Now I will tell you what there's some issues with the Dba Tools module if you import the SQL PS or the SQL Server module first. And I've even tried to import it with the force so that it would basically clobber any of the commands that and I think allow clobber must be the default, because there's no allow clobber when you import a module. There is a no clobber, but there's no allow clobber. But we're probably going to see an error later in this demo, because something's not just right when you have those other modules imported and then import this one. So the Dba Tools module, just to give you an idea, it's got 712 commands. So there's a command for doing just about anything you could think of. And they take contributions from the community. There was a parameter missing on one of the commands I needed the other day, and it was the command to change the default database for a user, and it didn't exist. So I forked the repository on GitHub, and I put the changes in, and I did a pull request, and it was accepted the same day. So what you can do, you can run a lot of guys. They write Transact SQL, a lot of SQL guys, and they can keep doing that today, and they can just run that with Invoke SQL command. So I'm just querying SQL 08, getting a list of the databases and the recovery model, and I'm just using the same Transact SQL that I would run in SQL Server Management Studio. So I can run that with PowerShell. Now, one thing with filtering, it's just like with filtering in PowerShell, the closer you can filter to the data, the better you are. So if you ran this command and you ran select star from the person.person table in AdventureWorks, and then you bring it all back to your machine only to filter it down to the last name of Browning with PowerShell, it's kind of a waste. And you can see that that was a little sluggish, and it's really not a lot of data. But if you filter it at the SQL level, at the SQL server, you're not dragging all the data across your network just to filter it down at your machine. And that was almost instant. So what I'm going to do, so both these connections are already, you might say, warmed up. So this first one took 1.2 seconds, the first option, and the second option took 0.01 seconds. So the difference in those two is one was 27 times slower than the other. So how you filter your data and where is very important. You want to filter it at the source and only pull the records that you need. Back in the day, I used to write some Crystal reports, and I would see people writing Crystal reports, and they would write their SQL very generically because they would use the same SQL for different customers, and then they would filter it down in the report itself, and it took forever to run some of those reports because the developers of them, they were just lazy. Now you can run a stored procedure from PowerShell, and that's very simple. And these commands, Invoke SQL command even existed with SQL 2008, with the snap-in on SQL 2008. So a lot of DBAs, one of their concerns is, well, I've got all these different versions of SQL Server, and I can't write one command and run it across the board. Well, that's not true. You can. You just have to write it just like with PowerShell. If you got PowerShell 2, 3, 4, and 5, you have to write it to the lowest common denominator. So there are sometimes you'll run into a problem like when I try to run the stored procedure SP-who2. Well, the problem with this one is that there's actually two columns where they joined it. They're returning both the same column name twice, and PowerShell won't let you do that. So if I connected to one of my SQL servers, and I don't think it really matters which one I connect to. So you can see the SPIG column is returned twice. It's the first one here, and it's the next to the last one. Well, you can't have two objects in PowerShell with the same name, so that's the problem. And it's not really a problem, because what you can do, you can just write your own SP-who2. So what I'm going to do here, I'm actually going to use SQL Management Objects, or SQL SMO. And I think in the abstract, I saw one person, they tweeted and they were asking me something, and I had said a SQL DMO, which is deprecated and replaced by SMO. So I was kind of telling my age by having that in the abstract. So this is what you would get with the SP-who2 stored procedure. And of course, I'm only returning this big column one time instead of twice, so it resolves the problem. Then of course, you've got providers. And providers are a way to access data stores like a file system. And you can see the SQL Server module actually adds a SQL Server PS drive. So I can query the list of databases like I would a file system. And there's a lot more. I'm just using this as an example. So the command I ran with SQL management objects, you'll notice it's very similar, except it returns the user and system databases, where when I was working with the SQL Server provider, it only returned the user databases by default. And the way you can get around that, I believe, I think if you put force on this, that it returns them also. So it just filters the system databases. It's kind of like when you go into when you go look at the databases, you'll have your databases, and maybe I don't have one on this one. Let's see, database engine. So yeah, I have my databases, and my system ones are kind of hidden. They're hidden in a folder. But behind the scenes, all these examples I've shown you on returning the databases, they're all the same type of PowerShell object. So they're an SMO database. So when I was using SMO SQL management objects, it's a database object. Well, when I look at the type of object, when looking at the databases through the provider, it's the same type of object. Oh, and I had the note about the force parameter here. So with the newer versions of SQL Server, or if you install the SQL Server PowerShell module, there's commands for doing all this stuff. So you can run get SQL database so it feels and looks more like PowerShell. So it gives me exactly the same thing I showed you before. So there's like 50,000 ways to do the same thing. And ultimately you end up with the same type of object. Now one thing I will tell you, so I'm querying a list of the SQL agent jobs. And I wrote a blog article about this because I was working with these and I was like, hey, there's no start SQL agent job or no stop SQL agent job. There's no commands for that. And Rob Sewell, he's the one that he was like, oh, there's a method for doing that. So, and you can see there's only a get SQL agent job. So it's kind of like back in the days when you're doing like PowerShell 101 and you run get service on Windows, and you don't have to use stop or start service. You can just call the stop or start method. Well, it's the same sort of thing here. So if you look at the methods, you've got a stop and start method, and there's a lot of methods. There's actually, let's see, yeah, I'm only returning the methods. So if I wanted to back up the database or run this plan, and it only backs up the one user database, but I can actually call the start method and it'll back up the databases. It'll run that job. So the Dba Tools, they have a similar command. You can run get Dba database. Similar output. Same type of object. They have an Invoke Dba Query, which is very similar to Invoke SQL command. I believe we're going to get an error on this one. Yep. So if I took the same command, it's because they recommended that, hey, we close and reopen PowerShell. And let's make the font a little bit larger here so it's not so small. Like I said, this the Dba Tools, you know, you're probably working with one or the other, but not both, because when I loaded the SQL Server PowerShell module and then loaded the Dba Tools PowerShell module, they, for some reason, don't like one another. And I have it drilled down to look at that. So if I look at the history on that job, I can see that it's been run twice today. I went through this demo earlier today, and then I just ran it again at 21:07 or at 9:07. Those of you who my wife always hates that, like my phone and my watch and everything is set on military time. So okay, well maybe you don't want to use any of these PowerShell modules. And at one time, so you had to install like the SQL, you had to run the SQL install on the ISO and install the PowerShell module to get it on a client. And that actually installed like the SDK. So there was a good bit of overhead. And there was one command that somebody had written, and it was called Invoke SQL Command 2. And I know Warren Frame has got a copy of that. He's done some modifications too, because I stole his. But anyway, this is not what I stole. Not this part. So I wrote a module called Mr. SQL, and I wrote just a SQL data reader. And I'm not a developer, but the good thing about PowerShell, and you write these commands, you write functions, and you have to learn how to do it one time, and then you can forget all that, and you just call the command from now on. So I'm retrieving information about the backups of the pubs database on SQL 05, and SQL 05 is Windows 2008 non-R2 with no PowerShell. So you can use the .NET framework, and you can actually use SMO or any of that to query the machine that does not have any PowerShell installed. So we're not using like PowerShell remoting for this. And then if you wanted to, you could take that command and wrap it into its own function, and then you could just run that function instead of putting all your SQL with the data reader. So you can see this is a list of all the databases on all those different servers. Oh, and here's the Invoke SQL command too. So yeah, this is the one I stole from Warren Frame, the Cookie Monster on Twitter. But it returns the same thing. So a lot of SQL guys, they'll ask, okay, well, you showed me all this. I can do all that in SQL Server. I can just write transact SQL. Why do I need to learn anything else? Well, the reason you need to learn something else is because maybe you want to take data out of one system like Active or like SQL Server and put it into Active Directory. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to query my SQL 2012 box, the AdventureWorks database, and I'm going to get a list of, let's just pretend that's an HR database. So I want to query it and get a list of all the information to create some Active Directory users. So I'll go ahead and query it. So I've actually got 290 users in there. So I did most of my work at the SQL level. I did all my joins and all to get the email addresses, get the names, get the user IDs, get their title, get their phone number, and so on. But then also did some cleanup on the PowerShell side. So I'll show you there are no users in this one particular OU. And you can see that this is that OU. So I can press F5 and refresh, and you can see there's nothing in there. So what I'm going to do this time is run measure command, and the only difference is I'm going to pipe the output to new AD user. And this will tell us how long it took to create these. So it took 3.5 seconds, and yeah, those temps, you know that you pay a week to key in these 290 users, you won't need them anymore. So you can see there's 290 users. If I do a refresh, there they are. So I can look at one of them, and they're all like this. So I've got their phone number, I've got their name, and the great thing about using this instead of using temps to do it is I don't have one all in uppercase, one in lowercase, and so on, you know. I have their address, I have their title, and at least some of them should have had a phone number. Oh, well, the phone number was on the first tab. So I've got all those created exactly perfectly. And at this point, I'm going to jump back to my slide deck. I do want to show you one more thing before, because I wanted to mention Powershell Core. So if I ran get module Dba Tools, actually I don't want get module, I want get command module Dba Tools. So those are all the commands. 712 commands. If I ran the same thing in PowerShell Core, and I think this is 611, this was current as of last month. I think there might be a new minor revision out. But you'll still get the same results. Yeah. So let's see if it's going to make a liar out of me. It did have all of them. So maybe they've made some updates.
Well, did you recently download it? Because they just completely rewrote it. It actually, you don't even have to do it this way. You can now install it directly on PowerShell Core.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can fire up a Linux box, install PowerShell on there, and now run the Dba Tools from that Linux box and connect to SQL Server.
I do see this one says 1.0, and this one in the Windows one says 0.9. So
yeah, they just redid it.
So I've got a few resources in here, and the slide deck is available as a PowerPoint or as a PDF if you guys want it. So there's some links to the PowerShell documentation, the best practices and style guide, the Microsoft Virtual Academy, which is going away, and the replacement for it. I forget what they're calling it, but not all the same content's on there. So, you know, I'm not sure if they're going to be adding all that or not. PowerShell.org, the forums are probably the best ones out there. There's some other places too, but I find that the people are more helpful on PowerShell.org. Planet PowerShell is a good aggregator for blog sites. User groups, that's where you are tonight. PowerShell community videos, there's a link to that. I think that's a GitHub project that Joel Bennett came up with. So you can see videos from all different places all over the community, like our user group and all different user groups. It's kind of an aggregator for videos. Twitter is a good place to find help with PowerShell. Slack, there's several different things with Slack. There's PowerShell.org on Slack. There's the PowerShell channel. PowerShell Summit, if you're going to the PowerShell Summit. This is my last slide, my contact slide, so it's where you can find more information about me, book projects I've taken part of. My email address, I always tell people to go out to my About page, and it's encrypted, so decrypt it and send me an email.